What is it you want, Barry? What do you want? You want the moon? Just say the word and I'll throw a lasso around it and pull it down.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, dying times here.
Come with me if you want to live.
That's it, man. Game over, man. Game over.
The Force will be with you, always.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to 20th Century Geek. I'm your regular host, Scott Weatherly, and today we're going to be talking The Batman. That's right, for 80 years he's been donning comics, movies, television shows, and any kind of merchandise you can think of. And here today, myself and Julian Darius are going to be talking about Batman. We start off with a general discussion about the Caped Crusader, and then we're going to get into the stories, two stories in particular, that we really like. Our go-to Batman stories. This is part one of a two-part series. So, I'm not going to waste any time. We're going to don our cape and cowl, and we're going to jump straight in to us talking about The Batman. Okay, so Julian, welcome back to the show. And
it was my pleasure to be here.
And as always, I think it's going to be a good conversation. So, it's 80 years of Batman. The Dark Knight has been around since 1939, and in that time, there's been a number of iterations of Batman, from the dark, gritty, street-level vigilante to the day-glow, neon Caped Crusader of the 50s and 60s, through to the sort of revisionist Dark Knight of the 80s and beyond. And I sort of asked you a question, sort of for this, and I think it's going to expand on, we'll use it as our foundation, was who writes your Batman? It was like, which team and which story represents sort of like your Batman? And I was thinking about the same. And that's really what I want to get into, is sort of like, how do we interpret Batman, and then really sort of use that to discuss those interpretations of Batman, and not that any of them are invalid, but sort of like, how it can he can be perceived and be received by different people. But really the question I'm going to is just
I'm really eager to it because...
Sorry, say again?
Not a easy question for me. I sort of took some time to sort of think about it. I think part of the challenge is that, there's a difference between what most represents Batman and what is the best work. When I think of all of the works that, are, sort of shortlisted for best Batman ever, you think of sort of, Dark Knight Returns, Killing Joke, maybe Long Halloween, maybe for some people it's Hush. Most of these cases, they're not really that representative in some way. And, I find Dark Knight Returns, is sort of orgiastic, kind of crazy mix of violence, and Batman's riding a horse, and it's visually striking, but it certainly doesn't epitomize Batman. I mean, Killing Joke is kind of, arguably, you could say it's, epitomizes Joker in some way, but does it really epitomize Batman? I'm not so sure. It's certainly a kind of grim Batman, but I don't think of Batman as being epitomized by a kind of, like, puzzle story. Same thing with, like, Arkham Asylum. I mean, that's not representative, right? So, it's an interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, the two you've sort of said there that I've sort of got into recently, I did a review and analysis of The Dark Knight Returns earlier in the year. And although I sort of enjoy it as a book, I very much agree. I don't think it's representative of Batman. It's a Batman, but the thing that sort of kept striking me in that in that book in particular was, how can someone stay that angry for that long and not have like stress-related illnesses?
Right.
And I think that's the thing that sort of, like you say, throughout all these representations, the thing that sort of, I was thinking about this quite a bit the other day. The one thread, well, there's two threads I'll pick up, but the first thread that really sort of struck me is the problem with the representation of Batman is Batman's origin. The idea that obviously he saw, for the spoilers for those that don't know, but you should know, of an 80-year-old character. He obviously saw his parents murdered in front of him by a random thug in Joe Chill, and then that led to him sort of swearing vengeance on the bodies or the graves of his parents, and then he went on to train and to do all this other stuff. And then when you sort of see that that's been the sort of the footnote or the keynote for all this for 80 years, it felt difficult to associate that to sort of all the different representations of Batman. Do you know what I mean?
Associated in what way?
So it's almost like, when I see the Dark Knight Returns Batman, so when I see Frank Miller's Batman, he is still clearly driven by an anger. Is it because of his parents? Recently, Garth Ennis did Punisher Max, and in that he took the idea and ran with it, that the Punisher, instead, Frank Castle, he was grieving for his wife and children when they were killed, but he actually then used that as an excuse. It was almost like a springboard for allowed him to let his psychosis go and to be this vigilante, to become the Punisher. And it sort of made sense. It was almost this idea that actually, that happened, but it was always in there. In Punisher Born, it was there during the war, and it was still carrying it. Right. So, and with Batman, it's sort of like, you say, okay, well, that happened, and then you've gone on to do some really sort of crazy stuff based on this one thing that was real street level. And then, to associate that one incident, that one trauma with, like you say, Frank Miller's iteration of Batman, or Scott Snyder's version of Batman, or then the Chuck Dixon Batman of the 90s and those sort of things, I struggle to keep that link to say that, oh yeah, that's your origin. Oh, of course that's your origin. You're born in grief, yet 15 years later, there's still that anger at crime. That sort of thread was where I sort of not so much struggled, but it seems like sometimes versions of Batman lean away from that, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I do. I think it's an excellent point, and I think Bourne is the go-to example there as well. I think that's excellently chosen. I know exactly what you're talking about, and so many of us know someone who lost their parents, or their parents were abusive, or what have you. Maybe they didn't lose their parents in an alley with a shooting, but I mean they lost their parents to cancer or disease or what have you. None of them went on to become vigilantes. And I think what bugs me the most is the sort of like generalization from, and it really bugs me, it's the generalization from Joe Chill to all crime. Like the problem is crime. And it was many years ago, but This American Life, which is an hour-long show on National Public Radio that I adore, did a superhero or superpowers episode, and they quizzed people about, what superpowers they would like and why. And it got pretty deep as far as, like, what this would mean psychologically, that you like flight or invisibility or what have you. But one of the interesting things is not a single person ever says, I would go out and fight crime.
Yeah.
Everybody would use this to like, well, I'd love to fly because then I could get to work faster.
Yeah.
But I'd love to be invisible because I could shoplift. Nobody's interested in fighting crime. And I find decision to dedicate your life to fighting crime is a weird one. But I think we're also, we're so used to it that we equivocate between being a vigilante and fighting crime, because people can be weak. The world does have vigilantes. I mean...
Where is it? I don't know if it's near you. Is it Phoenix Jones in America that's got the...
Yeah, exactly.
So...
Yeah, I mean, we have people who do this for real. but they're not obsessed with crime.
No.
They're not stopping heists. They're not, like, going into the hood and shaking down drug dealers, right? Nobody has ever done this. This is very strange. So, I mean, I guess that, you know, I mean, of course, like, I mean, I'm at the point where, and it's true in both the stories that we chose, that there are sort of flashbacks to their origin. Yet another, I mean, I think general movie audience goers are at the same point where I don't ever want to see another flashback to the pearls dropping.
Yeah. It's the two origin stories that no one ever needs to see again is the Waynes being murdered and Peter Parker being bitten by a spider. Like, nobody needs it. Everyone knows it. And it's an interesting sort of. I understand it, like you say, when you look at it in the context of the 30s or the late 30s, you know, that you're coming out of that sort of the pulp era, you're coming out of that sort of thing. Comics are sort of coming into their own. When you get that origin in the comics, like, it makes sense. You've come out of a period of what would be tantamount to sort of like gangster warfare in parts of the country. You know, you've had your Al Capones and Elliot Ness, you've had your Depression, you've had a lot, in a period where, you know, all that's come about. It sort of makes sense through it, sort of like as a to live vicariously through this character, you know, to sort of fight back. But say 80 years later, I struggle to connect it to a functioning human being.
No, I totally dig what you're saying. I mean, I feel the same way. And, you know, and I like what you say about that anger, especially in Dark Knight. Get some therapy, man. Get over it. You know, and like you say, I mean, maybe it's ripe for a sort of born kind of thing. You weren't that well before this, man. Little young Bruce Wayne lighting insects on fire with a magnifying glass or something.
Yeah, no, like you say, it's it almost comes down. I mean, you know, I know that things can be born out of trauma and stuff, and I understand that, but it almost comes down to this whole thing of, like, you know, blaming the blame culture of sort of like, you know, well, movies, you know, make people into killers or computer games or, you know, gangster rap or whatever else is going to get the blame. But there's always an underlying thing there,
right?
Even if at 11 or 10 or 12, however old, you know, young Bruce Wayne was supposed to be when he sees that event of his parents being murdered, and he's taken home, and then he decides to go on a world trek to educate himself, you know, to become the best detective and the best martial artist. I don't know a single teenager that doesn't end up in Thailand to meet with some monk and then just get completely derailed and ends up in the bars for 18 months.
Oh, wait a minute! I can drink here.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. No, that's quite true. I mean, you have to imagine sort of young Bruce Wayne as an insanely ambitious guy. And I'm kind of talking myself into it because I can identify with that. It's kind of a childhood dream, right? I'm going to become the best, right? The best at whatever it is that I throw myself into. And, I mean, it's very American as well. I mean, we have this problem over here of everybody wants to be the best, and they say, I'm not going to go into any field unless I can be the best at it.
Yeah.
But there is that kind of ambitious thing of sort of young Bruce Wayne was going to be, like, the best physicist around, you know, and he would have thrown himself into his studies completely until he got derailed by this murder and just decided, yeah, you know, I'm going to tour the world and hone myself.
Yeah, and even, like you say, you know, they've had several opportunities. I mean, they did Earth 1 as well. Jeff Johns did it and stuff. And even that, like, it felt... The books are actually quite good. You know, and they've grounded them and they've sort of shown him in a year one kind of way. But it still feels, like you say, to hold on to that level of angst and anger, it just becomes... I say, you know, and also to have that, you know, because this is one of the other threads it leads into, really, is to come back and you've dedicated your life to this idea, this ideal of, let's say, to be the best detective, be the best martial artist, to be a physical specimen that can go out on a nightly basis and fight crime. And then you're going to have this alter ego as the playboy, sort of to throw people off. So you're going to have the sort of the Bruce Wayne playboy image, and you're going to have the most beautiful women and the most expensive cars and the most expensive, champagne and wines and caviar and all this other stuff. And at no point does he stop after 5 years of having the crap kicked out of him, saying, "Do you know what? There's better ways of doing this."
Yeah, the playboy half of my persona is having a lot more fun.
Yeah, yeah.
He likes beating people up.
And I think that's what you've got to get to, isn't it? That's the thing you've got to get into. That actually, what does this get to a point where it stops being about him fighting crime and actually about him working out his own issues, but actually taking some level of enjoyment from beating people and being the best and proving himself again and again? Oh,
I think so. I think there's got to be some aspect of that. And then you have the detective aspect that sort of like that has kind of fallen by the wayside recently. But the idea of sort of solving puzzles, of being mentally engaged. But still, it's tied to, I'm going to stop crime. I'm a secret agent for my own agency that I've set up because I'm a billionaire.
Yeah, and that's the sort of thing. There's only so many hours in a day, and it seems to be that Bruce Wayne doesn't sleep.
Yeah. Yeah, there's that problem too, right? That he never has downtime. Yeah, I mean the problem logically that I always return to is, if you want to fight crime, you have billions of dollars. Surely there's a better way than building a Batmobile.
Yeah.
There's no way this is sufficient.
Well, that sort of comes to the second thread of all this, is he is a obviously his wealth has grown with inflation over the years. But he's meant to be like a multi-billionaire. He's got all this technology, and it's sort of come up a few times. I mean, Grant Morrison we'll probably get into it when you talk about the stories you talk about, but Grant Morrison sort of covers it with Batman Incorporated. Mm-hmm. And then more recently, Sean Gordon Murphy has done it as well with White Knight. This idea of sort of Batman reaching the conclusion that actually, yes, I've got myself and the Bat family that have got access to this kit, but you know what? All this Kevlar, all these sort of the Batarangs, all these, tracking gadgets and all this other stuff, if I was to give this to the police, I would be better arming the people that are actually doing this for a job 24/7. That would probably be better. And so, yeah, it's an interesting concept of like you say, it's about him being the best. And I always feel like with Batman, there's a selfishness. I don't know what you think about that.
No, I agree with that. I mean, there's a kind of playboy aspect that's indulgent, right? It's still there. That's real, right? I mean, he's absolutely... I mean, come on. You've made an army of batarangs and bat-themed weapons. You've got to be indulgent, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. When we talked about this, I flicked through some of the old books. I went through the Grant Morrison run. They open the concept of Batman Incorporated with Bruce Wayne stepping onto the sort of the steps of one of his buildings and sort of saying, we are opening Batman Incorporated across the world. I'm going to fund it and all this other stuff. And he's backed up by 4 giant bat drone robots. And the way and I'm like, okay, they've tried to play this to be really cool and it looks great. But I thought, if Elon Musk stepped out onto the steps of one of his buildings and said the same thing, we'd be terrified that this was happening.
Oh, absolutely, and I think we should be. I mean, but I think that's part of it's kind of like the thing that I'm fascinated by with Iron Man. Like, if Tony Stark had Iron Man technology and stood before Congress and said, "F you, I'm not giving this to you," nobody would think he's a hero.
No.
I mean, this is just sort of training us to think that the millionaire and billionaire class make good politicians and, they're really smarter than the rest of us and deserve that money or something. This is some kind of weird fantasy see going on here.
Well, this is the one thing I found strange over the last year, that Batman's popularity maintains. I mean, literally, in the last couple of days, they've potentially cast the latest Batman for a 2021 release, and so his popularity and his interest remains. But in a time when we have had Occupy Wall Street and the sort of rebel against the 1%, and then the continuation of a businessman as the president, this realization that actually the wealthy aren't the be all and end all, and actually they're manipulating things behind the scenes to ensure they stay wealthy and all this other stuff. Like I say, characters like Bruce Wayne and Tony Stark, the fact that they remain hero characters, I find interesting, because really, when it does come down to, in many ways, is the fact that he puts on a batsuit and goes and beats up poor people.
Right, yeah, absolutely. I mean, and yeah, they're depicted as geniuses, but they're depicted as geniuses in very unrealistic ways. I mean, the epitome of this is Iron Man 2, where Tony Stark says, "Oh, what am I going to power my heart with? I'll just synthesize a new element." I still think that's got to be one of the worst moments in all of cinematic history. I'll just synthesize a new element. Talk about a MacGuffin that can solve any problem, right?
Yeah.
Jeez. Yeah, so I mean, they kind of are depicted as sort of worthwhile in this special way. They're geniuses. Bruce Wayne is so determined and a great detective and everything else. A little crazy. I mean, at least they kind of acknowledge he's a little crazy. But does have this kind of, and Dark Knight Returns kind of gets at it, this sort of like Ayn Randian kind of, I'm special. The rules don't apply to me. Thing that you do see like in Trump. I mean, you do see that attitude in a lot of the way we treat the wealthy, right? I mean, like Murdoch is not. I don't think even people who defend Murdoch think he's a good guy or something, or a genius. But yeah, I mean, I want to see scenarios in which these are bad guys. In which I mean, Tony Stark is not really helping anyone. Batman's not really helping anyone. But those would not qualify out for either of our lists of essential sort of defining Batman stories at the same time.
Well, that's it. I think because that was one of the questions that sort of sprung to mind. I'm not. Maybe I'm going to spring at you now, but is that thing of like, they talk about diminishing returns, but with the way sort of society is changing and the views of society is changing, do these stories have almost like a time limit on them, really, for these characters? Well,
I mean, I think one of the, I think Batman is more versatile. And one of the reasons why, I mean, I chose the saga of Ra's al Ghul. I grew up saying Ra's, so I know people say Raish, and, it's got the, but is because it has a kind of, like, adventure theme to it, right? I mean, it's almost, there's a very sort of James Bond, Indiana Jones kind of vibe to it. And I find that sort of thrilling adventure story, is not necessarily timeless, but certainly adaptable to new eras. You almost forget that you don't really need Bruce to be all that rich for those stories to work, right? I mean, the wealth is just an excuse to be able to fly around the world. Maybe you need a Batmobile in one scene, or, a science lab, but really that is an excuse for him to have his own sort of MI6 or his own sort of, secret agency that he's created for himself.
No, I agree. I think that's the sort of thing that they've tried to sort of, you can tell they've tried to address it in different ways through the ages. And like I say, more recently, the stories have they either become incredibly small in scope or they become incredibly large in scope to sort of circumvent this idea that, he's fighting street level crime, he's not really going and like you say, fighting a mugger or picking these things up. What he's actually doing is he is, now he's fighting Doomsday or something else on a much larger scale, where it's sort of like the supervillains, where you need him to have. You need Batman to take on the Scarecrow or Ra's al Ghul or the Joker, because it's that level of craziness. And so that,
and I think I prefer the street level stuff, but I think that certainly Batman has you were talking about how the Dayglow sort of 60s stuff. I mean Batman has proven very adaptable, and I think you can kind of like shelve all of the millionaire stuff in a way that you can't, frankly, with Tony Stark, right? I mean, Tony Stark is wedded to that. You can strip Wayne Enterprises and the Wayne fortune from Batman entirely. It doesn't, you can take that too far, so it doesn't really feel like Batman anymore. Frank Miller's Year One script, thank God this thing was never made, he doesn't have his inheritance. He's hanging out in the garage with Alfred the whole time. He makes the Batsuit out of like brass knuckles and stuff, and it's really cool. But it does feel more like sort of like a superhero Dirty Harry than it does Batman. But you can maybe push that too far. But I mean, you can imagine, we've all read stories of sort of Batman. Maybe it's the end of Dark Knight, right, where he's just in the caves with the mutants. Batman can be lost in the desert and, lead a resistance movement or something, and it still feels like Batman. So I think that you can kind of de-emphasize the wealth stuff or emphasize it more depending on what your tastes are.
Yeah, so it's like a barometer that you can move. Like I say, you can move it up and down to sort of, especially for the purpose of the story. And I think that element of wealth has been used, like you say, it's always been there for Batman, but it's been used better. Not better. It's been used in different ways for different characters. Cause I always think of like Oliver Queen as Green Arrow. There was a time when he obviously needed all these trick arrows, and the only way to have trick arrows is to be a multi-billionaire. So he was Queen Industries, but then they stripped him of his wealth at one point, and then he got it back, and he's lost it a few times. And there are other characters as well. I think they've done it for. If they're going to have that sort of level of gadgetry, if they don't have ingrained superpowers, they need something that separates them, and so they need access to incredible amounts of money to have the gadgets and that sort of thing.
Right.
And
I think that going back to like the earliest Batman stories, that seems to be which aren't questioning the wealth at all, right? I mean, he's meeting with Commissioner Gordon as Bruce Wayne, so like obviously he's a scion of Gotham City, right? I mean, he's got pull, but his life is Bruce Wayne. I mean, there's no Wayne Industries back then. This was just like the Shadow. This was just an excuse to give him all of those gadgets. Yeah,
and I find it interesting because it's funny, sort of that idea of having to justify the means with which to sort of either make or purchase this technology and these gadgets. A good example actually is another one of my all-time favourite characters is Moon Knight. And when he was obviously created in the 70s, and they sort of tried to make it, Marvel made him his own thing, and they made him that his backstory was he was a mercenary, and they thought, okay, he's now going to become a vigilante. He's going to do all these other things. He's got his 3 different personas as they were when he began. How does he fund all this? Oh, well, actually, because he was a mercenary, he actually had a hoard of wealth sat behind him, and he's actually invested it really well. We won't talk about it beyond that, but that's what happened, and then they sort of move on from there. And again, sort of that end of going through that Bronze Age sort of comics, you can sort of, they got away with that. It was like, yeah, this happened, this is where it came from, don't worry about it. And it's sort of never really been spoken again. It's sort of come up a few times with Moon Knight, but they've tried to deal with it. But I say with Batman, it's that thing of sort of, it's either been in the forefront or it's been in the background, and it's sort of depending on that story and who wants to deal with it, I suppose.
Right. Yeah, well, the same thing's true of like Rand Industries, right, for Iron Fist. That's not even in most of the Iron Fist stories. But then it's big components of others.
Yeah,
So, more Green Arrow, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, same thing. I suppose it's interesting. It's sort of like when you think of the characters, and when we sort of thought, asked about the stories, it's like, well, what defines the character then? What are the key elements that you have to have for that character to be that character? And like you say, although you can turn it up and down, like a thermostat kind of thing for the wealth, is Wayne Industries and the power that brings him, is that fundamental to the Batman and the Bruce Wayne character?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know that Wayne Industries is. I mean, I think that the tropes of the Batcave and the Batmobile are, I don't know if they're essential to sort of the DNA of that character, but that's getting pretty close. I mean, if you strip Batman of having any of the gadgets, and he's just a guy in a batsuit who's tough, it doesn't really feel Batman anymore.
Yeah.
You want the Batmobile at some point, right? You want, and the Batmobile can't just be Volkswagen. You put metal plating on, right?
No. Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean,
it's interesting because I say it's one of those things that sort of when you look back at the things that define Batman, even when you look at those original serials, from the sort of the 40s and 50s, you say about them having he had a regular car. And it doesn't work. It needs to be something special. And I think you're right. The gadgets are a big part of that and what defines him. But that sort of strands. So you mentioned it before, but so let's get into the stories then that we've we talked about as the stories for us that define Batman, or our go-to stories. Really was the question. So, which one did you sort of say then? What's the one that you thought of?
Well, I decided on the saga of Ra's al Ghul, sort of focusing on the sort of classic O'Neill run there around sort of 1970, 1971, but then arguably extending, like through the 80s and 90s where you get the sort of 3 graphic novels and up into like Batman and Son with Grant Morrison. And I think that people forget that he was a kind of special villain for a lot of this, that from the 80s and the 90s, and really, it was really in the 90s when they, like, involved him in, like, Batman Legacy and all of this, that he kind of became a more standard villain. But he was kind of like the special villain that you didn't want to feature too often. He was hard to write. It was easy. It was easier, and you could just do a silly Joker story. Joker's made Jokerfish, or Joker's now the ambassador for Karak.
Yeah.
You could do that, but Roz was somebody special that was kind of reserved for it was a big deal when he showed up.
I know what you mean. Ra's al Ghul is an interesting character, I say, because it's that thing again of moving away from that street level villainy, isn't it? Like, because Ra's al Ghul's ambitions are global. I mean, he's looking on a much bigger scale, on a much wider sort of playing field, and I think that's why it's quite hard to write him, really. But I also think he's an interesting villain in that sense for Batman, that in some cases, like, when he's written well, Ra's isn't entirely wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I do like that saga, and I like the fact that it's been dipped into.
Well, I think another reason why I find it representative. I mean, I like that there's a kind of arc to it, even though obviously now we're so many years out. We're 48 years out, that lots of different. You've got like Nice, another daughter, and like Talia's worked for Lex Luthor, and I mean you've seen lots of permutations, but I like that there's an arc to it. I like that the sort of Talia stuff is part of it. The sort of idea of there's a plan for Bruce is part of the plan here. It's not just Batman versus the villain who wants to destroy things, but it's Batman versus the villain who not only has a plan for a world but has a place for Batman in it. And another thing is that difference between like the street level villains and the totally unrealistic kind of Killer Croc sometimes Penguin, the sort of unrealistic side. And I think that's always a balance in Batman stories. And you can really push it toward the street level side and strip away any superpowers, and like Mr. Freeze is not going to show up, right?
Yeah.
He just does not belong in that universe. Or you can, have Batman fighting Darkseid, and then it's almost like, well, what's the point of having Batman fight Scarecrow anymore? Or just another gangster. But Roz kind of like bridges that middle ground in a really interesting way for me that strikes me as, I understand why he was chosen as the adversary for the first Nolan film. That they wanted a villain who could be realistic, but their definition of realism was, and they explicitly said this, a kind of James Bond level of realism, where it's realistic, but you have gadgets, right? So, they didn't do the Lazarus Pit, but the idea that there was a League of Assassins was fine, right?
Yeah.
And I think, like, even the Lazarus Pit, like, the sort of, like, mystical element kind of work for me in that kind of James Bond adventuring sort of way. That, yeah, it's a stretch, but, obviously he is immortal and has access to this. But that technology isn't, like, it doesn't bug me in the way of, like, how do you have a freeze gun again?
Yeah.
And how is that technology not altering the world as we know it?
Yeah.
It's more on that kind of, like, mystical side. So I find that it kind of, like, bridges the gap between the sort of just street-level stuff, which I don't know embodies Batman, because I think we probably prefer it to the wacky world, universe-spanning Batman, but not necessarily. So I feel like that's another reason why I made that choice.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, you say James Bond, and I think, there's that comparison to, like, Blofeld and Spectre, really, isn't it? That sort of the idea of it being a well-organised sort of enemy organisation. You can have those adventures. It can be that sort of adventure story rather than sort of, like, say, the gritty street-level punchy stuff. But, yeah, cause I actually like this. I haven't read the entire saga, I suppose, because I know that I've read a lot of the Neil Adams stuff and the Denny O'Neil stuff, and I really enjoy that. And it's the birth of the demon in the middle, isn't it? That has sort of jumped in and out of continuity. And I do like the idea of this character that's he's always there, and he obviously has ambitions, but because he's got that Lazarus Pit, that ability, he's endlessly patient. So he's like an endless threat that sort of sits in the background that could really strike at any time. And it's always going to be when it's on his terms. No, I like that as a character. I think he's an interesting sort of device. But how about how those characters? So talking about Denny O'Neil, about how he writes and everything. Batman. How do you feel that 70s version of Batman works for you?
Oh, I love it. In fact, in going back and rereading for this podcast, I found the other stories. And some aren't up to snuff, and even Ra's al Ghul stories are not as good as others. But man, I was looking at DC Special Series number 15, which is a late chapter that's not Adams, but is O'Neill kind of coming back after, I think Len Wein has had a few Ra's appearances, and O'Neill comes back, and it's not a great story. Ra's is robbing diamonds in Gotham City, for God's sake. I mean, it's not good, but the Talia stuff is great. But what I found myself amazed by is there's a story before that in the same, this was like a Batman Spectacular that, the Indicia list is DC Special Series 15. But it was like, if you bought it on the newsstand, it was just Batman Spectacular or something. And the first story is amazing. And it's not even seem to tie into a mystery writer, and there's this hangman figure that appears on Batman's headlights in the Batcave, or you keep seeing like another an arm added, and a tail, and Batman can't figure out how somebody is putting time-delayed ink on his headlights. And at one point he's with Gordon, and Gordon notices like the mark of a noose around Batman's neck suddenly appears, and it's so creepy, right?
Yeah,
I
like that.
It's great, and that's the same that I Die at Midnight prose story that O'Neill did. That's was in like the greatest Batman stories ever told. So I grew up reading it. That's in that same special, man. And those three stories. The weakest one is the Ra's al Ghul story.
Yeah.
So I mean, I found myself getting lost in a lot of those other 70s stories. Some of them are still like the Batgirl and Robin stories feel a little more 60s, a little more like they have the pre-O'Neill influence. But I find that kind of, I was amazed by how much the sort of 70s stories work for me today.
Oh,
what about you?
No, I agree. It's one of those things. I dip back into them because I really like the 70s era for comics in general. I find that it's a transitional period, and I really do feel there's some great stuff in there. And Batman in particular, sort of, the pendulum swings, as you say. There's some stuff that harkens back to sort of like Silver Age silliness, which has its place and is fine, but is a bit weaker in that 70s. But there's still stories that really stand out, like especially within, let's say, the Denny O'Neil and the Neil Adams and Denny O'Neil stuff, where I love that art as well. But there's a couple here. I've just got in front of me. It's The Secret of the Waiting Graves, and it's Batman and Robin, Detective Comics, Batman and Robin 395. And it's this idea of sort of Batman ends up sort of finding out about these two people, that this wife and this husband and wife that have managed to sort of feign off death, and he's trying to get to them, and eventually, like this, spoilers, it ends with them sort of accepting their death and actually returning to their grave. And although it's a Batman story, it has like an EC Comics kind of sort of feel to it. Like I say, quite creepy, and it's really good. And then you get into sort of the other one that I really got into was the introduction of Man-Bat. And how he's really played like a tragic character. And you get to learn about him and Dr. Langstrom and his wife, and how they sort of it gets into a little bit of their relationship, and I was really impressed. With the sort of some of the it's a level of sophistication that I think was being introduced at that time in comics.
Yeah, and I think the easy comparison is quite apt there. I think that a lot of the issue that introduces Ross, I think is such a masterful issue. I mean, in my notes, I just wrote classic at the top and drew an arrow to it. And it's got a little clunkiness here and there, but it does feel like a James Bond adventure in which, first of all, let's just stop and say O'Neill changed Batman. There's a reason why he was group editor of the Batman titles for so many decades. I have so much admiration for O'Neill, and I think that what O'Neill was doing with Superman, with Justice League, putting him on a satellite, and, when he got rid of kryptonite and sort of like depowered Superman so that he wasn't just flinging planets around. I mean, so much of what you never get a Watchmen or a Dark Knight without O'Neill laying the groundwork. No. And O'Neill was doing the kind of revisionist takes on superheroes in the 70s and doesn't get nearly enough credit for it. So I think that everything that, and certainly with Batman, I mean, O'Neill and Adams, but O'Neill was writing more stories than Adams was illustrating. And O'Neill brought back Batman being this creature of the night, and Batman being a detective and dealing with these kind of spooky, potentially disturbing tales. And he doesn't get enough credit, and I think that era doesn't get enough credit because it is the kind of, in retrospect, it sort of becomes this transition era between the 80s and Dark Knight and revisionism and the 60s kind of silly Batman. But I challenge anyone to read some of these stories and not say these are really well-crafted tales that anyone could just be thrown into and enjoy.
Oh, I agree. I think you're right about O'Neill and his, him transitioning Batman. I mean, he moves him out of the cave as well, and sort of moves him into the penthouse in sort of Wayne Tower. He makes sort of Batman more, more relatable in a weird way. But like you say, he ups the sort of detective element, and it's really good stuff. And I think you're right. Without this, you wouldn't have, like you say, The Killing Joke or Dark Knight Returns or anything like that. This is where it starts, really. And everyone talks obviously about the 80s, but yeah, this is it. I mean, the thing is that you're right. The thing I say, it is a pendulum, because you do get the stories, like you say, the ones you've mentioned, that are really good and quite sophisticated and have an intricate plan. And then they're followed by, there's a story here called The Silent Night of the Batman, and it actually ends with Batman singing with some Christmas carolers.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, so
why not?
Yeah, exactly. So it swings and roundabouts. But you're right. This era is incredible. And the one thing I say again, because I'm a big fan of Neil Adams' art. He's older now, and I think his style recently has become a bit more sketchy. But the other thing is the Silver Age Batman is very blocky. He's very big, and he's very sort of cumbersome and that sort of thing. But this Neil Adams Batman he's sort of, he's sleek, he's athletic. He's not like a hulking giant, is he? This is just a really well toned, athletic individual, and it just comes across like that's what he would be. That's sort of he's not going to be. I always find that difficult to say when I read the Dark Knight Returns, and you've got the Frank Miller sort of, he's sort of 6 foot tall and 6 foot shoulders across. You think, well, you're never going to be. It doesn't feel like you'd be that sort of athletic and jumping off buildings. But this one feels like he could be a gymnast. He's closer to what I think of Nightwing now than that sort of thing.
No, I think that's exactly right. And as you were talking, I was thinking, oh boy, that's exactly right. And he has a gymnast body, where you can imagine him sort of swinging from buildings, and and I think that I think you're right that I'm reminded of how my Superman sort of has the same physique. My Superman, I cannot see, I can't stand the sort of like muscle-bound Cavill sort of, as Superman. But, Brandon Routh is kind of perfect. This sort of like graceful pirouetting through the air is so much a part of what I like about Superman. And seeing that blocky, muscle-bound guy in the air, I think that's cool, but that's not Superman for me. And I guess I feel the same way about Batman, that sort of like lithe gymnast sort of like, I mean, he doesn't have broad shoulders. So much of it is, that sort of like vertical look that O'Neill brings.
Yeah, and it's so iconic. I mean, it's sort of, it's the sort of, I don't know whether it's a colouring choice or whether it's supposed to represent, but like you say, the greys and the blues as well, sort of, and the yellow oval with the bat symbol in. To me, I mean, that's the Batman I grew up with when I was a kid.
Right.
Me too. It's quite funny that as I got older and I saw representations of just the black bat symbol on the grey top, it took a long time for me to accept that as like, oh, okay, so that's sort of what it should be, or what people, that's the original, that's how it is. Because that orange oval, the yellow oval with the bat symbol is to me what I always remember.
Yeah, and I think that it's, it's more iconic. It changed less. I mean, that just a black bat symbol, I mean, I adapted when that came back pretty quickly, but that black bat symbol changes depending on who's illustrating it to a vast degree. And, in fact, when they went back and recolored Killing Joke, they took out the yellow oval. And, it doesn't look as good.
No, it doesn't. I think it's a really iconic look that, whether it makes sense or not, it is irrelevant. It just looks. It's that iconic. Right. It's that iconic nature of it that I think is, is so good. But it's definitely a sort of an era that it should be. It does get lauded. Now people do talk about it, but I still don't think that people revisit it enough.
Yeah.
Like you said, when people list out those great ones, it's sort of, I think there should be more there for the Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams stuff.
I think so, and I also think that as I get older, I find myself going back more than going to more recent stuff personally. And I find myself sort of rediscovering older stuff, and some of it doesn't hold up, and some of it does. In the kind of classic era Roz stories, it concludes with a three-parter where this is the most amazing thing. Like, you've had sort of the first story is just Talia, and then the second story is sort of introducing Ra's al Ghul, and it ends with sort of Talia, wants you, and I want you to be my successor, and it just abruptly stops there. And then you get, some more, a few, 1, 2, 3, really, just a couple more Ra's stories, and then O'Neil sort of launches into, like, okay, time to wrap this up, and you get a three-parter where it begins with, it's just amazing to think how compressed this is. Like, this would be a crossover today.
Yeah.
Like, it begins with, I've killed off Bruce Wayne because I'm about to go to war with my greatest enemy.
Yeah.
The only man who I can't defeat. I've never been able to defeat him. I don't know if I'm going to win this war. I've got to kill off Bruce Wayne just to even attempt this, because having Bruce Wayne active, he knows I'm Bruce Wayne. Okay, for God's sake. What a great way to introduce the guy. But, there's this sense of, like, forget Bane.
Yeah.
Roz defeats Batman back then.
Yeah.
This is like, you really get the sense of, like, this has been coming, and here is this endgame big conflict.
And this has never been collected as a sort of, like, there's no one done. I can't believe DC. I mean, you get the Neil Adams and the Denny O'Neil collections. I've seen those, but you never really get the that Ra's story. Should be surely that's an addition. That's an omnibus waiting to be put together, isn't it? Really.
Well, I collected it back in the 80s. I think it was indeed 1980 that they, back when DC was doing, like, it was the same sort of, like, Baxter format that they did the Neil God's 6-part collection with Kirby. They did a 4-issue, 2 stories per issue reprint called Saga, and then they collected that, with slightly different stories as Batman Tales of the Demon. And I had printings of that. And it's about 200 pages, and it's sort of like all of the early Raw stuff. And I didn't really realize that it had everything in it at the time. At the time, I thought DC's collections were always kind of like all over the place, and I didn't realize, oh yeah, this has all of the stories in it. But apparently it does, and I read that as a kid, or slightly older, but I guess it's been out of print for a long time now.
Yeah, no, I'm actually just looking at it here. So you've got Batman Tales of the Demon, and yeah, it's out of print, but you can pick it up for about, well, it's about £20. It starts at about £20 as a sort of, as a new and used. So you can still find copies of it. I'd have to have a look at that, because I think to see that all in one collected edition would be really cool. I do, yeah, that because it's dipping into it this time. I mean, it's there are several moments in that story, not that three-parter, but say the introduction of Ra's as well, that is so 70s and incredibly badass as well. Sort of like, you know, the duel between Ra's and Batman in the desert, and you know, Batman gets stung by the scorpion, but he's doing he's doing it all bare-chested, but still in the cowl, like
right. Well, I mean, the way in which he always has the Batman cowl on is so funny.
Yeah, but yeah, it's sort of, you know, it maintains a sort of Alan Moore sort of achieves later on that you can have certain things that you know, if you take it at surface level, they look ridiculous. He did it within the Swamp Thing run quite a bit. You know, you think, oh, that's crazy, but with the prose and the story that's going with it, it sort of works. You go, well, of course that's what happens. Of course that's who he is, and that's how he would handle it. So I sort of just accept it, but it does look really cool, and maintains that iconic stance.
I like the sort of like swashbuckling adventure stuff, like, you know, like the first the issue that introduces Ra's. They go to Calcutta. And then they're in the Himalayas a few pages later, and they have this big mountain fight with a sniper, and it's all to test Batman, you know. And there's that kind of like Indiana Jones or James Bond kind of like sense of adventure and sort of globe hopping stuff that also was one of the things that made those stories special. That it took Batman out of Gotham City.
Yeah, because I think that's the other thing as well. It makes more sense that, you know, that if he's going to have a wider impact on the world and a wider sort of, you know, remit, then you can't keep putting it in Gotham City, because after a while you think housing prices in that city must be atrociously low. Like, you know.
Oh yeah. It's a terrible place to live.
Yeah, like, no one lives there. No one should live there. It should be, that city should be bankrupt. There should be no industry there. There should be no shop. Like, no one should be there. It makes no sense. But you just, again, it's one of those things I suppose you just accept.
I did want to highlight, you know, of the later stuff. There were the three graphic novels that were produced: 87, 90, and 92. I mean, relatively early in Batman history, right? So, you know, Arkham comes out 89. 2 years before that is the first of the Ra's graphic novels. So, you know, when graphic novels are still relatively new, when Batman gets a graphic novel, it's going to be with Ra's, right?
Yes.
You know, it's like he's the guy who's reserved for the graphic novel. He's the special villain. And of those three, the one that was maligned for so many years is my favorite, the Son of the Demon, that, you know, later retconned that's Damian Wayne. And man, you know, I Mike W. Barr writing it, but the art is beautiful. You know, it's by Jerry Bingham, and the main plot, you know, has like, you know, Kane or Kayin as this villain, but you know, it occurs to me that going back to James Bond, like my favorite, well, you know, one of my two favorite Bond movies is You Only Live Twice. And the reason is because it kind of acknowledges the fantasy element of this. Like, this is a fantasy for everyone in the audience, but within the narrative, the way that context is made into the text is sort of Batman, James Bond sort of being married for a little while, you know, to a gorgeous girl and laying down his burdens. And in front of the Batman, you know, Batman joins Ra's. And it's sort of like the ultimate end to that story is sort of like, well, what if Batman said, okay, Ra's, I'm gonna join you. And he's hanging out and playing chess with Ra's, and he agrees to honor his marriage to Talia. And he even says, like, I'm happy. You know, he says, I haven't been happy for so long, and I'm happy. And it's really an amazing story. And, you know, of course, they're uniting to stop this villain who's a mutual threat both to Gotham and to Ra's. And Talia gets pregnant, and all of a sudden, Batman changes because, you know, if you're Batman, you know, you think like, okay, I've laid down my burdens, I'm happy. But if you're Batman because of what you were saying, of, you know, crime alley and crime. And here Batman's saying, like, the one thing I can't do is put myself and my wife at risk and have this kid grow up without his parents. I grew up without my parents. And the moment she's pregnant, he says, I'm done. I'm out. This is what my life is about now.
It's interesting. I haven't...
It's like, wow, that actually makes sense.
Yeah. And that's it. I think, like you say, it's one of those things. It's a bit like sometimes certain writers just take characters to that inevitable ending, don't they? Where you go, well, they have to say this. This is the core of what they are. This is how it has to happen. And like I say, it makes total sense. And it is great that I think that, like, you know, that Batman, that Grant Morrison picked up on that and it reintroduced it, and we get Damian Wayne, that I think is a bit Marmite. I think some people love him, some people hate him, but I kind of like that it brings him into continuity, and, you know, continuity being what it is, it's very elastic. So those things can have happened at any point in the Batman years.
Right, and Son of the Demon was out of continuity until Grant Morrison came in, and you know, and I think that as far as, I don't want to be such a snob that I, you know, and such an old fogey that I only like the 70s stuff. I only, you know, like, let's go back to Miracle Man. I don't want to be that guy. You know, Batman and Son, you know, although it's aging now, you know, it's not super recent. You know, I think it's an amazingly fun ride, and it has that same sense of adventure and sort of James Bond is spinning around the world sense that those old Raw stories had. And it's kind of like Grant Morrison doing sort of late Grant Morrison, but kind of Grant Morrison doing a standard superhero tale in a way that is tremendously successful. I think that some people see him as like the weird, obscure author, and other people see him as like, yeah, you know, they've only encountered him through maybe Batman Inc. or you know, now Green Lantern, you know, and sort of more Final Crisis and kind of more, you know, sort of conventional stuff that, you know, they like or they don't. But, you know, Batman and Son strikes me, you know, I mean, and a lot of the Grant Batman runs strikes me as Grant really succeeding in that mold.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. The first part of our discussion about the Batman. We talked about what we thought about the Batman, and then we started to talk about Julian's favourite go-to story, the saga of Ra's al Ghul, or Ra's al Ghul, depending on your preference. In the next episode, we'll do some more discussing about Batman, especially as a detective, and we'll get into my favourite story, my go-to story. So I hope you're going to enjoy that. It's a fantastic episode. And I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. What are your thoughts on the Batman? On Batman and Bruce Wayne? Who writes the best Batman? Who writes the best Bruce Wayne? What's your go-to story? What do you love about Batman? What do you like? A favourite artist? Who draws your Batman? When you see Batman in your mind's eye, what's the voice? What's the iconic silhouette that you see? So I hope you enjoy the show, and next week there'll be more Batman talk. So get in contact, let us know. Contact me at email at Gmail. Contact me on email. That's 20. Fucking hell. Contact me on email. That's 20thCenturyGeek@gmail.com. And you can find us on all the social media platforms: Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, the rest. Instagram, we've got some fantastic pictures up there. Go over there, subscribe, join our account, follow us on those social media platforms and find out what is coming next. Also, if you wanted to support 20th Century Geek in any way, there are several ways you can do that. The best way, most simple way, is to get on your podcast catcher and give us a 5-star review. Subscribe. Let your friends know about us. Tell us why you like the show. It's fantastic. If you wanted to throw some coppers our way, All donations are greatly appreciated, no matter how big or small. Go find out our Patreon account. And on Patreon, we are now doing some regular podcasts, additional podcasts. I now look at several films a month and ask the question, is it really that bad? We've recently looked at films like 1999's Godzilla and the 1987 Arnold Schwarzenegger film Raw Deal. And ask the question, as I say, are they really that bad? Go find out what I thought. And on now monthly, myself and my wife Alex sit down and we watch something nerdy. I love it. She has no idea. Let's find out what we think about it. And of course, there's other things we can do. We have an Amazon wish list. And over there, there's a whole series of books and things that really help with the research for the shows. And of course, in 20th Century Towers, we love second-hand books. So go and check that out. And in the meantime, stay safe. And we'll be back. Same bat time, same bat channel. I'll see you soon.